Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our webinar today. It looks like some folks are still signing on, calling in, so I'm just going to wait maybe like 1 or 2 more minutes before getting the webinar started. So thanks for joining us, and we'll begin shortly. Okay, everyone, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's webinar, Realizing Full Employment, Bold Policy Solutions to Advance Economic Opportunity for All. We are really excited to talk about this topic today. My name is Carrie Felton, and I'm a graduate student intern with Heartland Alliance National Initiatives on Poverty and Economic Opportunity, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. Before we get started, I'll just cover a few housekeeping items. Everyone listening to the webinar right now is muted. You can use the chat box on the control panel or the questions box over on the side to ask any questions at any time. Logistical questions, if you're having trouble with the audio or you can't hear me, you can ask questions there and we'll try to get that resolved. Also, we really encourage folks to ask questions for our speakers and panelists as the presentation is going on. We're going to have time at the end of the webinar to answer questions, but go ahead and send those throughout. We'll collect those along the way. Want to make sure you know that the slides and the recording of the webinar will be made available on our website, and everyone who registered will get a link in an email after today's webinar is done. For those of you on Twitter, we invite you to tweet along with us using the hashtag at the bottom of the slide there, hashtag opportunity for all. And we also have a couple of handouts available over on that side panel under handouts that you can download, and you'll hear the speakers reference those during their presentations. And speaking of speakers, we have some great panelists today with a lot of experience and knowledge on this topic. But before we hear from them, I wanted to tell you a little bit about who we are. So Heartland Alliance is a nearly 130-year-old human rights and social service organization headquartered in Chicago. And the National Initiatives on Poverty and Economic Opportunity is part of Heartland and is dedicated to ending chronic unemployment and poverty. We work kind of at the intersection of research, policy, and practice to effect change that is informed by evidence and grounded in the experiences of providers and advocates across the country. And some of those initiatives are the National Transitional Jobs Network, which supports transitional jobs and subsidized employment models, which we will talk about a little bit more today, as a key intervention for people facing barriers to employment. our Be More initiative, which is dedicated to improving the employment outcomes and economic health of low-income men and youth of color, and our National Center on Employment and Homelessness, which works to ensure that employment in quality jobs is a key part of our efforts to prevent and end homelessness. So before I introduce our first speaker, we want to learn a little bit more about you. So I have a couple questions, if you guys wouldn't mind participating in a quick poll. So first, okay, so if you could share what best describes your role. Okay, looks like we're getting some good responses in. I'll give you guys a couple more seconds to fill in or answer. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close it off. Looks like about 80% of folks have responded. Let me share the results. It looks like we have about half the people who are joining us today are employment program providers. We have about 21% policy advocates, 2% research, or 10% researchers, 2% philanthropy funder, 29% other. For those who marked other, if you want to just send in kind of like what your role is via the chat box, you can. You don't have to. This will just kind of give us a sense of who's on the call and what we need to go more in depth with, things like that. So I have one more question, which is, what are you most interested in learning about today? This will kind of give us a sense of areas we might want to spend more time on or go in more detail on. Okay, a couple more seconds. All right. Okay, looks like we have a lot of interest, about 40% interest in policy solutions and strategies, 29% employment program implementation and best practices, 10% employment program design, and 21% general overview of these subsidized employment and transitional job strategies. So a pretty good mix. Hopefully that will be helpful to our speakers and kind of tailoring their presentation. Thank you all for participating. So with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Melissa Young. She's our director here at National Initiatives team, and she's going to kind of set a framework for today's conversation and give us a little bit of background about why we're here today. So I will pass it over to you, Melissa.
Thanks so much, Carrie, and thanks so much for everybody who is tuning into today's conversation. Before I jump into our conversation today, I also just want to give a huge thanks to our friends at Georgetown, to community advocates, and to Senator Baldwin's office for joining the webinar today and for really conveying your wealth of wisdom and expertise into this conversation. As Carrie mentioned, I'm the director of Heartland Alliance's national initiatives on poverty and economic opportunity. And as I'll talk a little bit about in a second, at Heartland Alliance, we have a really long history of supporting, advocating, and implementing these kinds of strategies across the country. The slide that's in front of you is really about, first and foremost, establishing a little bit of a precedent around really the conversation around having a national subsidized employment program. What does that look like? Where have we been in the past? And how does that inform where we're going in the future? I think in order to ground that conversation and the proposal that Indy and Julie and others will talk about today, and the legislation that Senator Baldwin's office is championing, is that we in the US actually have a really long history of thinking about, of advocating for, and of recognizing the role that subsidized employment and transitional jobs can have, really as part and parcel of our underlying labor market policies. Going all the way back, you'll see on the left-hand picture on your screen, those were images from really a lesser known but really important march on Washington on and around 1894, the Cox March on Washington, which was really calling for a national subsidized employment program, a federal jobs guarantee, and then all the way moving forward to really most recent history when we saw the wide-scale implementation of subsidized employment programs in several states across the country through the ARA-TANF Emergency Fund. And so really we hope that this conversation today is really grounded in the fact that we have seen these strategies be implemented over the course of the last 100+ years, and we continue to see a lot of energy and enthusiasm around the implementing and expanding these strategies today. Next slide. So as I mentioned really briefly, and I'll go into it just a smidge bit more detail, Heartland Alliance, through our service delivery, as well as through our research and evaluation and public policy shops, have implemented and evaluated and advocated for subsidized employment and transitional jobs programs for over 20 years. We, as Carrie mentioned briefly, have pioneered and worked alongside partners across the country to establish and maintain the National Transitional Jobs Network that is committed to expanding and strengthening transitional jobs programs across the country. Heartland Alliance, as a service provider, ran the largest statewide subsidized employment program under the recent stimulus bill, and we have a suite of programs at the organization serving youth, people returning from incarceration, and others through social enterprise models and other types of interventions. Our teams also within our research and policy department have evaluated these models in many different forums, and our teams have advocated for federal line items and supported the implementation of very large-scale research demonstration projects through the Department of Labor and through the Department of Health and Human Services. This is part of the reason why we're so excited about the proposal that we're going to be talking about today. As we've learned over the course of this work for the last 20 years, there are a number of elements within the proposal that we're going to talk about today that really do reflect our on-the-ground understanding of how to implement these program models successfully in communities, as well as how to think about the broad sort of policy structure at the federal level that can really support the implementation of these models during times of economic recession, as well as during good economic times. Next slide, please. At Heartland Alliance, I think we come away from our years and years of experience working in this space with two sort of primary lessons learned. And I think you'll see some of these sort of lessons learned and sort of orientation reflected in the proposal that we're about to hear more about. And really, our primary lessons learned are that people and goals matter. They should matter to all of our program implementations across the country, but they especially matter when we're thinking about the implementation of subsidized employment and transitional jobs programs. Really, your goals of your intervention should drive all of your design and your implementation, your partnerships, the kinds of support services that are offered to individuals, as well as your performance goals and your research questions that you might be thinking about. We think as we move into a period of time, particularly within the changing nature of work, that we should be thinking about these two primary lessons learned as being central to thinking about the future of subsidized employment and transitional jobs programs. Next slide, please. We do know over the course of the last 20 years through rigorous research as well as research in local communities and states that we've learned a lot. And all of these research, all of these bullet points can be found on our website, as well as links to the research studies if you want to go into a deeper dive. But we know that the benefits of these programs can far outweigh the costs in communities. We also know that when given the opportunity to work, time and time again, individuals take it. Even individuals who face extraordinary barriers to employment want to work. They articulate that work is an important component to them, and they take the opportunity to work when given it. We know through research, extraordinarily rigorous research, that these programs can reduce recidivism among individuals returning from incarceration. They can contribute to the success of children, and they can positively contribute to the economic health of employers and communities in a variety of ways. Next slide, please. And so where are we at now? I think our speakers will talk a little bit more about where we're at now in some of their remarks and some of what they're doing in their respective roles. But we know over here at Heartland Alliance that programs and initiatives, subsidized employment and transitional jobs initiatives, exist in over 25 states across the country. Now, that this doesn't mean that these are fully statewide models. A few of them are, but more often we're seeing smaller individual programs in communities serving a cross-section of individuals that face barriers to employment. But we also know that there's growing national attention from many, many stakeholders across the country to these interventions. As the proposal from Georgetown and our friends will illuminate, that's one really exciting place where we've seen growing national attention among leaders and experts in expanding the role of subsidized employment and transitional jobs programs nationwide, and really linking it to the fabric of our broader public policy solutions. In addition to this, we're also seeing across the country, really from coast to coast, an uptick in the number of proposals by thought leaders across the country calling for a federal jobs guarantee. And so we know from our vantage point, sitting in the middle of the country, that we're seeing these conversations bubble up in lots of places across the country, congressional interest in these programs, congressional action in these programs, which is exciting, and it's an exciting time to be thinking about what the future of these kinds of solutions could look like. Next slide, please. So finally, we're going to talk a lot today. We're going to go into a lot of depth about the proposal that we're about to hear and really the structure of subsidized employment and transitional jobs programs. But before I sign off, I want to make sure that I flag that if what you hear today is exciting to you and you want to get more involved and you want to learn more, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Our website is listed there. My email address is listed there. Don't forget to follow us on social media and sign up for our e-news to get more information. Thank you so much, and I'll pass it back over to Carrie.
Thanks, Melissa. So I just want to remind everybody, if you have questions along the way, please send those in via the chat box. And as you heard Melissa share, just a wonderful overview, the point of this webinar really is to advance subsidized employment strategies across the board. But I know a lot of folks are interested in what does the policy look like, and what would a national subsidized employment program look like. And so our next few speakers are going to kind of share a little bit more about what that might look like. Next, we have Meghan Ladwig from the Office of Senator Tammy Baldwin, and she's going to share a little bit about some legislation proposed by the senator. Meghan, I will just let you take it away.
Thanks, Gary, and thank you, Melissa, for the introduction there. I think that the best ideas come from the middle of the country, so this is one of them. My name is Meghan Ladwig. I'm an legislative assistant in Senator Baldwin's office. And Senator Baldwin reintroduced the Stronger Way Act last summer as part of the debate on tax reform. Carrie, I think you can go to the next slide. Senator Baldwin believes that tax reform needed to reward work and not just wealth, and I bring this up in the context of tax reform because at the outset the bill includes a substantial increase in the EITC for working families who already receive it and expands the EITC for workers without dependent children. We also strengthen the child tax credit in the bill, and as we saw at the end of last year, that's not necessarily the way that tax reform went down, and the bill was not included in those in the final tax reform bill, although it was proposed. The transitional jobs proposal in the bill is a critical piece of the Stronger Way Act, and that's because while tax reform for working families is important and hugely important, if you're not working and there are barriers to employment, a stronger proposal for poverty reduction would include a commitment to transitional jobs. And so Senator Baldwin is supportive of the local efforts of the state level transitional jobs programs, which can take a variety of forms, and her bill ensures that there's funding at the Department of Labor to support existing and new programs. In crafting this legislation, we hugely relied on the expertise and the brain power of the folks presenting today. So thank you to the folks at Heartland Alliance and at Georgetown, and for our local resident expert, Julie Kirkssick, and the others at Community Advocates who helped out on the bill that we were able to reintroduce this year. And just to go to the next slide, Carrie suggested that I may want to speak about what's happening on the Hill today. Senator Baldwin is committed to moving the proposals in this bill, and if I can be blunt, tax reform was a wasted opportunity to move the ball forward on poverty reduction, in our opinion, but we're going to continue to press for action. We're realistic about what may or may not happen in this immediate year. There may be a possible hook to infrastructure funding if we're able to get the ball moving there, and the jobs that should be created in that proposal. But we're going to continue to have conversations like this and gain allies. And as you can see, we have one in Cory Booker, who introduced the bill with Senator Baldwin, has been a great partner in this. We're certainly interested in learning more as the folks at Georgetown are developing more proposals and look to modify the legislation as needed. And with that, I'll move it on to the folks at Georgetown.
Okay, thanks, Meghan. If you have any questions for Meghan, specific questions, please send those on. We'll have at the end. And so next I'm going to introduce Callie Grant and Indy Dutta-Gupta from Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality. I think Callie is going to start their portion of the presentation and then pass it off to Indy partway through. So I will let you guys say more about who you are and what you're going to share today.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thanks again to the team at Heartland Alliance and everyone else. Our proposal was also informed by and builds upon the expertise of all of our co-presenters. So we really appreciate everyone's continued great work on this effort. So today, Indy and I will just give an overview of our recent subsidized employment proposal, which was just published in the Russell Sage Foundation Journal, and which provides another example of what such a national subsidized employment program could look like. Next slide, please. If you want to go a couple forward, actually. Perfect, thanks. So we'll start with a discussion of why a proposal like this is needed in the first place, what it hopes to accomplish, and how this proposal would go about doing that. We'll also go over some of the estimated costs and impacts of the program. Next slide, please. So first, there is a national need for a large-scale subsidized employment program, as some of my co-presenters have already mentioned. Even when the economy is doing well, there aren't enough jobs for all who want to work. And what we found is that there's a swath of American workers, in particular those with serious or multiple barriers to employment, that are routinely left out of labor force opportunities. This chart illustrates these different types of workers that make up the 14 million who are unemployed as of January 2018. And to break down the 14 million a little bit, that includes 7 million who are officially unemployed, which also includes 1.4 million long-term unemployed, and also 7 million who are not included in the official unemployment rate. And this includes discouraged workers or workers facing barriers to employment that make them marginally attached to the labor market, as well as 5 million part-time workers who, for economic reasons, but who would prefer full-time work. Next slide, please. Now this next slide, here are some of the different types of serious and multiple barriers to employment that these workers may be facing. So I'll skip over this for now, but we've included it in the slides in case people want to go back and look at it. So now I'll get into some of the program goals that we added into this proposal. So next slide, please. There are 4 main goals that this national program would work to achieve. The first is just to give excluded workers the chance to work and earn income and gain skills for unsubsidized jobs with on-the-job training while also accessing wraparound services like childcare. The second is to reduce poverty and improve long-term unsubsidized employment and other outcomes. The third is to provide marginalized communities with resources to meet needs. And the fourth is to provide small businesses and nonprofits a chance to test their growth through time-limited subsidies. In other words, to encourage employers to hire workers that they otherwise wouldn't hire. Next slide. So now I'll talk about what this program would actually look like, and later on I'll turn things over to my colleague and co-author, Indy, who will walk us through some of the estimated costs and impacts. So next slide, what we are proposing is a 2-pronged strategy that would address both broad needs and would also allow for the targeting of specific communities and populations. So what this means is that we're proposing 2 separate but complementary grant structures with parallel funding streams. So the first program is a formula grant that would be administered by the Department of Labor, and it would provide formula funding to states who apply and complete a detailed plan that specifies how they would use these funds in areas with above average rates of joblessness or poverty to target workers with multiple and serious barriers. And so this type of formula funding would allow states to address and reach a broad share of their struggling workers, but it also recognizes that within states, needs may vary based on geographic factors and ongoing structural changes in local economies. The second type would be administered by HHS and would allow eligible municipalities or private nonprofit organizations with demonstrated linkages to local governments to apply. And these entities would be chosen based on their ability to recruit target groups and provide meaningful work and training opportunities. So the reason that we did this dual agency structure is that both agencies have highly relevant experience and expertise, and we have designed it so that they would work in harmony with each other to administer these 2 programs. And as for the 2 streams of funding, they would be distinct, but on the ground recipient organizations would be able to mix them. So on this next slide, I'll talk about eligibility for participating workers and employers. So we wanted to keep things simple to both limit administrative expenses and to allow states and local entities to be able to best respond to their local needs. So on the worker side, what this means is that people have to be 18 or older and eligible to work, and they have to have been either unemployed for 60 or more days or have earnings below half the prevailing minimum wage in the past year. And we would prohibit asset tests. On the employer side, employers could be private, public, or nonprofit, and the subsidy for the wages would cover up to 120% of wage costs. That way, employers can get the wages subsidized and also some of the on-the-job training, benefits, or overhead. And to make sure that the right types of employers are participating in this program, we have allowed for several possible safeguards to ensure that employers are reaching workers that are best suited for these types of subsidized jobs. And most importantly, as would always be the case for these programs, subsidized workers wouldn't be able to replace unsubsidized or striking workers. So next slide, please. Much of this program design, like I said earlier, was informed by and built upon not only what the efforts of our co-presenters on subsidized employment, but also just what we have learned from over many decades worth of subsidized employment programs, many of which have been rigorously evaluated. And so, for example, we have made the job placement length, the target job placement length, to be 9 months because we found that longer lasting jobs are more likely to raise employment and earnings. This is also why we built in wraparound services, because we found that those are also important for the success of subsidized employment programs. Next slide, please. So here's a little bit more that kind of outlines some of the program benefits and duration. And the most important things that you need to know are that in the jobs themselves, workers would be paid the prevailing minimum wage or higher. And like I said, the job placement would be 9 months, but there would be some exceptions for training. And workers would be able, if they're not finding a job after 4 weeks after they complete the program, they would be eligible to apply for a different subsidized job with a different employer. We've also suggested some time limits, so 3 years of subsidized employment programs within a 5-year period, but we would suspend these during periods of recession. And on the next slide, there are some types of jobs that workers might have under these programs. I'm actually going to skip through this slide quickly, but we've included it again in case people are curious. And I've also provided a link in the notes that has an even larger list than this. So now I'll turn things over to my colleague and co-author, Indy, who will provide an overview of the estimated costs and impacts.
Thanks, Callie. So we proposed this as part of a larger series of innovative anti-poverty proposals published recently by the Russell Sage Foundation. And part of that process was working with outside researchers to develop estimated impacts, which I'll discuss. And in addition to that, we wanted to be sure that we would include some measures for evaluating the program sort of within the program itself. So first, if you go to the next slide, you can see that our outcomes include almost 1 million people and almost 1 million people lifted out of poverty, almost 500,000 out of deep poverty. As we've discussed previously, a lot of these parameters could be increased by making the program more generous or more expansive. We chose a specific sort of set of parameters based on a specific goal for overall funding. The program would cost around, I'll talk about it in a second, but around $16 billion a year. And within that, you see these impacts. For those who participate in the program, you see very sizable impacts. In particular, if I can draw your attention to figure 5 on slide 17, you can see the bottom row is deep poverty among participants. So this is an indicator of those participants who have income of less than 50% of the poverty line using the supplemental poverty measure, and you see a very sizable reduction in their poverty rates. And you can imagine that the participating population could grow a lot. We only target about 20% of eligible workers in our estimates and assume that that's how many will sort of take up the program. And you see sizable benefits in increased employment, but obviously the effects would be far beyond the specific worker, including to the household. And on the next slide, you'll see our estimated costs. I mentioned about $16 billion annually. At the time when we developed this proposal, we were thinking about a program that would approximate the size and scale of the current Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, which costs about that much at the federal level. But since we're only covering about 1 in 5 eligible workers, one could easily see how this program could be dialed up significantly. The basic premise for the part of the program that's a federal-state partnership is a match that's similar to the FMAP and Medicaid, which is essentially a calculation that the federal government sets out based on per capita income to determine how generous the federal subsidy will be for state spending within Medicaid. And in this case, we created a more generous version of that. The program would be voluntary for states. Our goal was to create a program that would be sufficiently generous that every state would choose to come into the program. Medicaid itself, as an example, is itself voluntary, and of course, every state has come in. Although, as we all know, they sadly haven't, with even more generous expansion that was in the Affordable Care Act. But so our goal was to create a set of match rates that ultimately would range from 75 to 91%. So to put that in perspective, that means if, say, one of the highest income states like California came in to participate in this program, for every 25 cents it spent, the federal government would give 75 cents to round out $1 for spending in this program. Just to add some more perspective, during the Recovery Act, the TANF Emergency Fund that Melissa mentioned had an 80-20 match rate and had a pretty rapid and significant participation, although certainly not everywhere. This rate would importantly vary and become more generous as economic circumstances deteriorated, and it would do so on a rolling basis. And the rates would, even as it would sort of be able to be responsive, one would lock in more generous rates so that states could rely on the more generous rates for a substantial period of time. And then the HHS grant, the competitive grant program, would be run very similarly to existing competitive grant programs. So if we move to the next slide, we want to point out that we think that a very important part of this proposal is that we've integrated evaluation and indicators and measurements of success. We'd be happy to dive into that more. But in general, we think that it's very important that the two agencies work together and be mandated and have sort of unified standards, performance measures, and thus help us learn over time what sort of approaches best work for which populations. Again, underscoring what Melissa said at the beginning about the importance of designing a program that meets the goals that you have in mind, and specifically for the populations you have in mind. But we have integrated here very systematic evaluation into the program. So with that, we are happy to take questions later, but that wraps up our presentation on this proposal, and we look forward to discussing it more, including ways in which it could be adapted or changed, potentially even at the state and local level. Thanks.
Great. Thank you both for sharing. Lots of great information. I see lots of questions rolling in. So with that, I will introduce our next speaker, Julie Kirksick from Community Advocates Public Policy Institute. She's going to share, she's been involved in, she's worked with all of the speakers who have just spoken, but she's going to share a little bit more of the on-the-ground perspective. And so, Julie, I will pass it off to you.
Thank you. I hope that I'm coming through. I had to use a speakerphone.
You sound great to me.
Good, good. I just needed reassurance. So I'm so delighted to be part of this group and this effort. And I think that if you're on this webinar, it's because you are probably have some very real sense of just how much we still, even in the midst of a kind of booming economy and low unemployment economy, we have huge pockets of unemployment and underemployment, chronic, and that results in people just not participating in the labor market in ways that hurt not just themselves and their families, but frankly, hurt our communities and our larger economy. So with that, I just want to say that the discussion about implementation for me is less about a lot of specific, please do this, and more about what are the kind of critical principles to keep in mind, because just as there's not one right design for subsidized employment programs, there's also not one approach to implement it on the ground. And excuse me. So in the first slide, please. That's why I start by just going back to ground that was covered through both Melissa and through our friends at Georgetown on the need to have clarity about the goals and your relative priorities. So it's also helpful, I think, sometimes to think about these in the categories of both participant goals and, in other words, goals that have an intended impact on individuals and their families, but also the goals that we can also bring to the fore regarding high unemployment areas or how this can be part of economic development. So in this slide, I just want to mention that just as there are different kinds of goals, the first one we talked about was that important one of immediate income. And by the way, the income coming from earnings is very important to the larger context of our political agreements, right? I think people want to support people supporting themselves, but the ability to be able to just get that, get income from earnings and become eligible for the earned income tax credit is really critical. So if that, when we were in the recession and the TANF funds were made available, it's really great to think about the primacy of the immediate income is what we saw at that moment, right? There was not a lot of requirements regarding who had to be hired for how long and so on. It was, we understand that jobs have just disappeared. People need jobs, people need work. We are going to support that. And it will be real work, but that the immediate income was the primary policy goals. As we think about subpopulations of unemployed and underemployed, and the need to get current labor market experience becomes perhaps just as important. Some of the training, skills training and certification, which can lead to better jobs, is also a specific kind of subsidized employment design. And obviously, we're always hoping that we are going to help people make a transition to unsubsidized employment. But we emphasize that in implementing the program, you want to make sure that you're doing a good job to meet those other kinds of goals and not only focused on who do we think is most likely to be able to be hired, most competitive in the labor market, because that tends to leave a lot of people out. Next slide, please. So when I mentioned the community and employer benefit, meeting unmet needs in our communities, especially in areas of high unemployment or poor transportation. Most rural areas are suffering from loss of key industries, or maybe they haven't ever had them for decades. But in urban areas, we often are faced with the issues of there are more and more jobs are being created in exurban areas, and if you don't have strong public transportation, they may as well be located 500 miles away rather than 50. Again, implementing with the thought that you are making sure that you're addressing those needs is critical. So we're going to address needs in the areas of high unemployment, not only, but in them, but we're also going to be able to address some of the issues that people have with transportation, because we're not going to only rely on jobs that require a car, for example. Lastly, I just wanted to mention that in implementation, I think it's important to keep in mind that goal that you can, subsidized employment can be a key piece of economic development strategies. And I want to use an example from the New Hope Project days, where we were initially really focused on some of the larger employers in town, and because we thought that they would be better jobs, for example. We invested months and months and months of negotiating with the highest levels of some very large companies and hospitals, only to discover after all those months that although the highest levels were really interested, by the time we made it through their HR processes, there were so many more things that were required in their hiring processes that the higher levels hadn't even understood. And it, for example, you know, what kinds of convictions would just keep you from ever being hired in that entity, or the requirement to have a driver's license, or the final say was done way down the org chart where there was very little interest in participating in this. We didn't give up. We never gave up on the larger institutions, but we certainly started paying more attention to smaller businesses, particularly in the 1 to 10 employee range. And I always share this example in Wisconsin because it's, I think, one that also reminds us of the synchronicity of politics and policy. We were working to get expanded subsidized employment funding in the state, and one of the leaders in the assembly, one of the Republican leaders, was very skeptical about the idea of using subsidized employment as a good use of public money, had a lot of skepticism about it. So he decided to try the program with his small business. He has a popcorn business, and he tried one of the workers from one of the employment programs, and frankly, it didn't work well, the first one. First person did not work out, but he said, all right, I will try a second worker. And that worker, this is maybe 6 years ago now, and that worker is one of his mainstay workers. So his experience in understanding how being able to try out someone that he wouldn't otherwise consider, and then moving that person into an unsubsidized position, had an impact well beyond the positive impact on both the worker and his business, because it allowed him to become a voice for this approach and model. I know I'm sort of maybe getting a little too detailed here, but so let's move to the next slide, please. In implementing, I think the most significant plea that I can make to anyone who is implementing subsidized employment is that it has to be about real work and about treating people as workers. And I mentioned there with rights and responsibilities. One of the biggest challenges that we face in getting widespread political support is this idea that we will just be spending public dollars to have people stand around and do nothing, or sit around and do nothing, or not show up and have that be okay. So that has not been my experience in any of the programs with which I have been associated, but it means that you really do demand. So for example, when we set up agreements with work sites who would employ transitional workers, there was a contract, but they also had to show us the job description. The job description was then used and utilized in going back and getting feedback. There were site visits and from third-party monitoring. We also had people interview for their subsidized jobs. And that was key because that gave the message to both the worker and the transitional employer that we were serious about treating this as real work and giving workers the experience of what it's like to apply. And so that was something that we found worked well as sending the message both ways. And the rest of these points are pretty obvious, I think. The clear expectations and accountability, meaning always. I mean, that it is, you know, if an organization is simply using the labor for, quote, free labor, it generally will be obvious sooner rather than later. And when you see that, you will discover that it either means that they are doing something that requires very little skill development, or they are using it in ways that are perhaps unfairly taking advantage of the individual worker. So that kind of accountability on the work site is important. It's also important on the worker side. One of the painful lessons that I remember from some of our early days came when we discovered that a worker had not been showing up to work, and we didn't know about it until well after the first time period, or the 2-week time period. And we didn't know about it because the supervisor didn't think it was really that big a deal. So clearly, he did not see this worker as a real worker. And when the person wasn't showing up, we had no way of holding the worker accountable either. So that led us to do things like weekly timesheets where supervisors had to answer 5 quick questions about how is the worker performing, you know, absence, tardiness, are able to get along with other workers, able to accept constructive criticism, and so on. Those lessons are, again, always important, not just for the worker, but also for the supervisor and so on. I obviously, as Indy or Callie mentioned, we would not ever want subsidized employment programs to provide workers in the case of places that are either have workers on strike or are facing large-scale layoffs. Again, displacing unsubsidized workers is not good for anybody. Lastly, on this slide, the third-party monitoring I mentioned, we used intermediaries, and one of the things I discovered as the manager of the program was that I needed to put more staff resourcing into people who would actually get out and be doing site visits on a regular basis. That was something that I just hadn't fully appreciated, thinking that we would do it all with either phone calls or back in the day, faxes, emails, what have you. Quickly discovering that without somebody being on the ground, establishing relationships with both the worker and the supervisor, we couldn't really get a feel for how it was working. So that is, when I talk about the need to invest in resources, that's a significant one, and it's not easy because you have to trade off. You know, you're not going to have unlimited dollars, but that's important. Next slide, please. In the, I mentioned good supervision and coaching. What I want to add here is that another way that intermediaries can be helpful, and obviously for those of you who are currently working in employment programs, whether subsidized or not, this is not news to you, but we need, it is sometimes hard if there is a performance issue or some problem with the worker's attendance. Supervisors are not always all that comfortable directly addressing it. And so one of the things that we started doing was not every week or even every month, but occasional 3-way conversations with the staff person from the intermediary along with the supervisor and worker. And again, I know that all these things take time, and time is money, and so on and so forth, but you can get it down to a fairly efficient process, and it can make a huge difference because at the very least, if the supervisor will call the intermediary and let them know, it's not as good as being able to give the feedback directly, but it's important. And again, not providing feedback in times is, for me, a sign of disrespect. And again, we're trying to model that this is real work and real work situations. The last two things that I want to just mention are that with any models, there's a variety of time periods that you can put in for the subsidy. And as Callie and Indy indicated, there are some of the evidence has shown that, you know, longer periods of time can be very helpful. But, and here's one of my trade-offs again, you want a long enough time for someone to really learn, especially if it is a skill building situation. You want enough time for them to learn and to become adept at the job. But if you do it too long, it can become hard to create the incentive to keep moving. And that's why one of the things we talk about is doing time limited, where if the person is unable to get unsubsidized work at the end of their subsidized period, but they still need the income, then one of the things that we've been able to do is allow them to look for work, but return to a subsidized job if needed. And I think that the point I'm trying to make is that you're always trying to create incentives for people to take action on their own behalf, as opposed to, or behalves, whatever, as opposed to just having programs do things to them. And finally, work supports and incentives, financial incentives, I think are critical, especially for people who have been locked out of the labor market or not seen the formal labor market as a way forward. And the EITC is the most significant one, but I think there's also lots of other ways that people, retention bonuses and incentives to take on some training, those kinds of work supports can be an important part, not only of the design, but of the implementation. So the last slide just says trade-offs are part of the reality. And the last thing I'll say about that is that, especially as you try to move to scale with guaranteed jobs, I think it's important to remember that if you want a program that can help the most people most immediately, that's the larger funnel, if you will, you may experience fewer people making immediate transitions to unsubsidized work, or you may not have as many good jobs at the end of the line. This isn't because you don't care about those goals, but if you are trying to make this available to the largest number of people who may have more barriers than others, then it's a way to make sure that they can participate as workers without saying, oops, you have the wrong kind of convictions, you can't get into this program, or you don't have a high enough numeracy or literacy grade level, so you can't get into this program, or you don't have a driver's license, so we can't let you be in this program. So again, it's not that you're ever saying, well, let's just settle for a not very good job or for no skill building, but just being clear that as you implement programs, the closer you get to being competitive in the labor market, that means that you're probably leaving more of the unemployed people on the sidelines. So with that, I'd like to stop. I know I went over time, I'm sorry, but I am happy to not just take questions now, but in the future, people should feel free to reach out and contact me individually. Thank you.
Great, Julie. Thank you so much. That was just so much really, really good information. I learned a lot. And I will share everyone's contact information at the end of this presentation. But now I will open it up for questions. I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Katie Schnur, who's been collecting questions throughout and can moderate our question and answer portion. After we take a little bit of time to answer questions, we will close up with a few slides and then end the webinar. So, Katie?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for all of you tuning in, and for those of you who submitted questions. We've got a ton of really good questions that came in, and so I'm just going to kick it off with saying, Indy and Callie, we got a number of questions about some of just digging in a bit on the weeds of your proposal. I've set aside a few that I think would be pretty great to answer here. So first question that I'll pitch over to you two is, will this program design be different in urban versus rural areas?
Great, thanks, Katie. This is Indy. Yeah, the program as designed at the federal level would be sort of uniform in the sense that localities could bid for individual groups for the grants, and the federal-state partnership would look similar everywhere. Of course, there'd be lots of flexibility. As a result of that, we suspect that the program on the ground would look quite different in urban versus rural areas. Just to take the example of wraparound services, and this is also relevant for many people with disabilities, in rural areas, you might find more substantial investment among these programs in transportation to help people access jobs, and even childcare might be farther out of reach in some places that are more rural. So we do expect that the program would look differently on the ground, but the federal sort of framework is intended to be sufficiently flexible to accommodate those and other sorts of variation.
Great, thank you. Another question about the program is, could you please explain the rationale for having the competitive funding stream administered through HHS as opposed to DOL?
Yes, this is Indy again. That was a tough one. Julie can, who is a co-author of this proposal, can vouch for this, but we actually went back and forth quite a lot, and would be very open to other arrangements. Ultimately, I think we thought the bigger program should be Department of Labor, both because we wanted it to be seen first and foremost as sort of a jobs employment program, and because employer engagement is going to be a major part of this. And if the U.S. Department of Labor leads the bigger federal-state partnership, that typically will mean that they're going to partner with state departments of labor. To be clear, we think that the rules and various criteria should be harmonized across both programs. And we also thought that, in particular, a lot of the research would come out of the competitive grant program, and HHS particularly has a lot of experience with program evaluation, not that the Department of Labor doesn't, and it with administering competitive grant programs.
Great, thanks. And then the last question that I'll ask you guys, oh, sorry. Okay, that was me echoing. The last question I'll ask you all, specific to the program, is when discussing the program design of these types of grants and funding opportunities, is there any discussion about involving direct providers who don't solely focus on employment? That is to say, how can other community stakeholders be involved?
That's a great question. We expect that other community stakeholders would be involved. First of all, there could be multi-organizational bids, either for the federal-state partnership, because then the states might put out RFPs, or for the competitive grants. And because we subsidize and encourage funding for wraparound services, we would expect that if, say, for example, one needs behavioral health services
to target, say, a community that's struggling with substance use, like opioid or other challenges, that you might partner with a community health center or a similar sort of institution. So our guess is that there would be lots of community stakeholders involved with lots of these programs. So we don't sort of prejudge and mandate that. We just sort of create the incentives and infrastructure to encourage and facilitate that.
And to add on to Indy's point, especially for the competitive grants, part of the ways that the eligible entities would be evaluated in terms of who actually gets the grant would be how well they demonstrate their ties to these types of organizations. So obviously the more developed their proposal is and the more that they're laying out how they would engage these organizations, the more likely they would be to get the competitive grant.
This is Julie adding on as well. I don't know if I'm responding to the kinds of community organizations the questioner had in mind. But for example, right now here at Community Advocates Public Policy Institute, we're working on a project that is combining both employment programs, including subsidized employment programs, and helping people get access to health insurance, health care, and trauma therapy. And that's something that has been part of other efforts, but it's an example where we think that it's not something that is needed or wanted by every person, so we don't want to build it in and say this is a condition of participation, but we want to make sure that the staff are doing a good job of letting people know it's available. So I don't know if that's part of what you were referring to, but.
Great, thank you. Julie, we have a question that came in, or a few questions that came in that I'm going to direct to you. First one is, has the program that you discussed served people experiencing homelessness or
yes.
housing instability?
Yes, and that was not a primary, that was not the majority of participants that I've been involved with. But again, right now, our, if you will, parent organization here, Community Advocates, started life 41 years ago as an organization addressing issues for those who are homeless or are in danger of being homeless. So there are things that we were able to do to try to help occasionally prevent homelessness. I don't know if there's more. My colleague Connor Williams is sitting with me in the same room, and I want to let him answer this question too.
Yeah, well, Economic Mobility Corporation. Yeah, Economic Mobility Corporation out of New York did an evaluation of our stimulus-funded transitional jobs program here in Wisconsin. And the year prior to participation, the average annual income was less than $2,000. So some of the people were homeless, and a significant number had not worked in the formal economy 6 months prior to enrolling in the program. So it does address some people who are homeless.
And this is Indy. If I could just add quickly, there are a couple of programs that we document in a spring 2016 research review, including the DOE funds, Ready, Willing, and Able Pathways to Work program in New York City, and others that specifically targeted people who were formerly homeless. And we'd be happy to share more information on those programs.
Yeah, I forgot to do my commercial. I hope that people saw the slide that said, I think that really terrific resources are the report that Indy just talked about, and then the toolkit from Heartland Alliance.
Great, thanks so much. Another question, Julia, I will direct this to you. You talked a bit about it during your presentation, obviously open to other folks weighing in here. The question is, a barrier to employment is a lack of soft skills. Does an employer lower the hiring standard for an individual who is hired through a transitional jobs or subsidized employment program?
That is such a great question, and I'm grateful for it. it's not. It's yes and no. So it's really important that people know that there are expectations that are not dramatically different from their peers meaning other workers in the site. But there's no denying that part of what the best programs have done is that employers have seen this as something where they're going to try to be a little flexible. And again, I just used to say to some of the workers with whom I was working or who were part of our organization's efforts, I don't know how else you learn to be a worker without working. And so I know that there's a lot of effort sometimes to make this all very linear. Okay, first I sit down and I do my assessments, and then I look at my skill deficits, and then I do my soft skills. And you can hear in my voice, I'm not a big, I don't find linear approaches working. I think it is helpful to have high quality soft skill work that people can do off-site from the workplace. But what I most appreciate is if it's able to be incorporated during the time of the subsidized employment. So for example, maybe a couple of hours a week, you're returning to a central site and meeting with other people and processing some of your hard-won lessons in that week. So yes, the best programs have employers who are, if you will, providing maybe a little bit of flexibility, but they cannot, if they go too far in that direction, it is really bad, not just for the worker, but for their workforce, and then they tend to not want to be part of the program. Anybody else want to add on that?
Great. If not, I'm happy to move on to the next question. Again, we got a lot of questions, trying to get to as many as we can. This one I am going to kind of broadly direct to Julie, Indy, and Callie. The question is, people with disabilities experience barriers that inhibit their access to employment opportunities. We all know that a life on disability benefits means a life of poverty. How is disability employment being addressed through these frameworks? And this person clarified that they're curious about, Indy and Callie, both how your proposal might intersect with something like SSI benefits, as well as more broadly, what kind of transitional jobs opportunities might be available for folks with disabilities, including intellectual and physical.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. So our framework is designed to specifically increase employment among people with disabilities, including not only by identifying them as likely to face certain employment barriers, but by actually, this is why we are subsidizing wraparound services like transportation, among other things, in the proposal, because we think that's obviously hugely important to ensuring that some of these barriers are mitigated. And I'm not sure if any of my co-authors have anything to add about the other parts of that question. But.
Well, this is Indy. I'll just add that as far as how it directly interacts with those two programs, obviously, typically participation in those programs is longer term. Our program is limited to adults, so SSI for kids is not sort of directly implicated except through the parents. And we, as Julie mentioned, we think of this strategy generally as helpful in a concerted sort of intensive fashion. Of course, there can be recessions that mean that people need subsidized jobs for much longer, or people need it when they wouldn't have otherwise, and their only barrier to employment is simply just the lack of jobs. But that can often be the case even during economic expansions. For some people, they live in communities where there are lack of jobs. They may have a disability that leads for them to being discriminated against in the labor market. And while it's first and foremost important to enforce anti-discrimination measures and change employers' attitudes towards people with disabilities, and others who they may discriminate against. We do think that the subsidy, as we've seen, especially with people with criminal records and who are formerly incarcerated in particular, can encourage employers to try to engage and hire and onboard somebody who they might not have otherwise for whatever reason.
And 2 quick points from me. One is, when I was working in state government in both Wisconsin and Colorado, was part of helping to get subsidized was the Department of Vocational Rehabilitation to really get excited about utilizing these subsidies in their work with people who were coming forward and saying, I want to work. They already had a lot of tools, but this was one more that gave them even more flexibility, and there were workers who jumped on it. Secondly, I have always liked it when people can take initiative and say, you know, I would really like to create a job, so that people who might have disabilities and have dreams about how they would like to be working, there's nothing in this program design that would prevent individuals from going to the program and saying, I would really like to do this kind of work. Will you help me find an employer who will structure a job around it? Oh, I'm sorry, there's a third point real quick. This one thing about the time limited that works well is that this generally fits within the rules on SSI that would, you know, where you can work a certain amount of time and earn money and not be penalized on either your eligibility or your amount of benefit. And then you have to make a decision. But that's another part of the win-win here.
Great, thanks so much. There are a few more questions that I want to get to that I think are important. Melissa, I'm actually going to pitch this one over to you, which is, I'm curious about different funding sources for transitional jobs programs. What are some of those sources? For example, who can pay for wages?
Thanks so much, Katie. That's a great question. So there's a number of different federal funding streams that can be used to pay for wages. We also have seen a number of different local municipal strategies to pay for wages. But I'll talk exclusively about some of the federal funding streams that are flowing into states and communities. So TANF block grant funds can be used to subsidize wages. Julie and others, I think, can talk to some of the implementation of how that's looked across the country in different forms. CDBG dollars at the local level can be used to subsidize wages. WIOA dollars can be used to subsidize wages under the training component of Title I. And I am probably missing a few. There are a few criminal justice funding streams as well at the federal level that can pay for wages. It's just about how you apply for the grant funds and how you include these funds in your proposals. I think the other thing to just sort of flag is that we've also seen across the country really kind of an uptick of the role of social enterprise programs. Certainly social enterprise programs are their own sort of models of paying wages, performing work and services in exchange for resources. But we've seen quite a few large-scale implementations of social enterprise kinds of models that have offset the cost of wages across the country. Julie or Indy or Callie or Meghan, others that I'm missing that I forgot about?
Not that I'm aware of. I think you got them all.
Yeah, it's pretty good. I think there's a very narrow possibility of using some SNAP money as well for these programs, which Oregon does.
Indy, did you say FSET?
Sorry, SNAP, The
SNAP,
food
yeah,
stamp.
fine.
Food stamp.
I was just making sure that's what you said. Yes, agreed.
Great. Okay, we have two last bigger picture questions. I'm going to toss this one out to the whole group. Anyone should feel free to weigh in. And the question is, how does subsidized jobs fit into a larger strategy that ensures a decent job for everyone who wants one?
Great. This is Indy. If folks don't mind, I'll just start. I think that we all share a goal on this call, Meghan, Julie, Callie, me, most everyone, and probably everyone listening and participating in the webinar, of ensuring that everyone who wants a job has access to one, a decent one, one that works with their needs. And we often think about, first of all, that there's an importance for sound macroeconomic policy.
This is Julie, for me, the wonderful thing when Senator Baldwin said, you know, I really want to take this on as and build a piece of legislation around this idea of not just the opportunity to work, but ensuring that
I'm not sure if Julie was cut off there. Anyone else have thoughts on kind of the role of subsidized employment fitting into this larger full employment strategy?
Katie, this is Indy. I could jump back in. I don't know if what I said earlier came out. So we often think first about the importance of macroeconomic policy, and that includes things like the role of the Federal Reserve and the role of trade policy and exchange policy. But then fiscal policy can be quite important. And in particular, as one of the early charts in Callie's slides show, we never really, even when we achieve what a lot of economists consider full employment, we never really create enough jobs, never mind enough sort of decent ones, for everyone who wants one. A lot of people can't get enough hours, just for example, as you can see in that chart. So we think of subsidized jobs as one particular strategy that's promising, underutilized, and could fairly easily be expanded to reach a larger share of people throughout the business cycle, and in particular people who, as we focused on, have serious or multiple barriers to employment, which can include sort of systematic barriers like discrimination, as we mentioned, but because of the nature of the program, both that it obviously reduces the cost of the hiring and employment, but also it can connect people, can be a platform to connect people with other services. And in our proposal in particular, we would fund other services that can help people succeed in the labor market and beyond.
Great.
The final thing go ahead. No, go ahead.
I do, just in the interest of time, I think this last question is important to toss out there, always trying to move things from the theoretical to the actionable. The question is, can you please let us know how we can be helpful in advocating for a national subsidized employment program? That's with an exclamation point, not a question mark.
I would say, at least, this is Meghan in Senator Baldwin's office, if you, we have a bill that's been introduced in the Senate, and it has a co-sponsor in Senator Cory Booker. If folks are interested and have a good connection to their, either their representatives or their senators, to flag this as something that's important to you for them, and for your communities to them, so they're aware of the proposal and can learn more. I'm happy to talk with you know, anybody who's interested in learning more here in DC to gain some more allies here and in the House.
Great. And I think on that note, I am going to pass the slides back over to Carrie so she can just wrap us up. Thank you all.
Great, everyone. This has been such a great webinar. So many good points, so many good questions. Please share the recording. You'll get a link to it in your in a follow-up email. We'll also post it on our website, the National Initiatives website. For this conversation, keep it going. Any questions that you might have asked that didn't get answered, we'll try to follow up with you via email. Also on our website are a lot of really great free toolkits. You heard Julie touting one of them already. Please download the handouts included on this webinar, which are in your control panel under handouts. One from Senator Baldwin's office and one from Georgetown. And here's contact information. I believe all the panelists encouraged people to reach out for more information, connections, furthering the conversation. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. Stay tuned for more webinars in our future. We have another one next Wednesday about work requirements and how we think these two topics are linked. So we think this is a great way to encourage folks and empower people to work requirements, not so much. So if you want to learn more about that, please join us next week. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.